and some strong words from the Prime Minister saying that Australians are going to be offended at these protests and they represent a double standard. What are your thoughts?
Oh, thanks, Tom. And I think the PM is spot on to be separating the issues of Indigenous disadvantage with the issues that we've seen aired in the United States. I mean, the issues of Indigenous disadvantage really are significant for our country, and we have really let Indigenous Australians down. And that's why the work that Minister Ken White is doing in the Indigenous policy space to enact components of the Uluru Statement is really some of the most important work of our government.
He's said some interesting things this morning, also saying, let's not import problems here. We've had no slavery in Australia. Is that accurate? The word's not often used, but we had forced labour. We had Indigenous Australians traded in this country as well, often paid a stipend, or it was indentured labour as well. I mean, we might not use the word slavery, but we've got our own dark history here, don't we?
Look, I think the Prime Minister's formulation is absolutely right, and he said that we should be honest about our past, about our history. He's a member for Cook. He has spoken at length about the links between Cook and the Indigenous people in his electorate. And of course, one other part of the Uluru Statement is around truth-telling, and that is something that our government is also working on. So, I mean, I'm interested in tangible solutions, and the Uluru Statement gives our country a way to address things like truth-telling, address things like Indigenous disadvantage, and I think that's very important work, some of the most important work of our government.
Well, a couple of elements on that. First of all, on truth-telling. So when you look at the history of Indigenous Australians in this country, as I said, thousands forced to work for no money, also being traded. This was happening, by the way, being forced to work right up to the 1970s. In the spirit of truth-telling, is that a form of slavery?
The truth-telling that we will conduct in this country, of course, is always going to be different to other countries, and I think you're looking to try and draw comparisons. And, you know, in the education system
I'm just
today,
asking about a definition of that, though, Senator.
Well, I'm not going to get into comparisons. The issues here around disadvantage, around the stolen generations, around policies which did not work in the favour of Indigenous Australians need to be told so that people have a full understanding of Australian history, which is exactly what the PM has said.
You also mentioned the Uluru Statement of the Heart. As it was decided, it's not going to be adopted in that form by the government, is it?
I'm not sure what you mean by that. The voice component of the Uluru Statement...
Well, let's take the Indigenous voice. Yeah, that's not going to be adopted how the people who decided on this wanted it to be.
But we're doing that. There is a co-design process which is being chaired by Marsha Langton, and that work is underway. That work is looking at how an Indigenous voice to Parliament, how an Indigenous voice to government could operate in the interests of all Australians, especially Indigenous Australians, and that is work that we will see very soon.
But it was to be enshrined in the Constitution. It won't be under the coalition, will it?
Well, if you go back to the Prime Minister's Closing the Gap statement, he talks about conducting the co-design process of the voice as a first step and then looking at the other legal arrangements later. Now, that is the recommendation of the bipartisan Joint Standing Committee or Joint Select Committee as it was on constitutional recognition. So we are following the bipartisan report. I think the Indigenous community that have engaged in that process would say it has been a good process.
All right, I want to move on to a couple of other matters. Of course, the OECD is Australia almost leading the pack on limiting the economic impact of COVID-19, already praised for the health impact being limited. Also a warning, though, about major new stimulus that's needed September and beyond, particularly as the moratoria on evictions ends. Is that a message the government should heed?
I think it's more evidence that this country is the country that you want to be in during this pandemic. On the health front, we've performed very well in terms of transmission, in terms of deaths, and also we've done very well on the economic front compared to almost any other country. So, I mean, the JobKeeper scheme has been a huge success. It has injected confidence into the Australian community. There is currently a review into that scheme, and we've always had an open mind about how it could be improved. But the point about JobKeeper is it was designed for a 6-month period, and it will be in place for that period of time.
But with that, obviously that's ending at that 6-month period. There's going to be some other things available to other sectors as we're reading the sort of tea leaves here. The point being that ending plus that prospect of moratorium on evictions ending. How should the people that at that stage are going to struggle to pay their mortgages or indeed paying loans on small businesses, how should they be treated? Do we need to think of a special stimulus package there as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my formulation would be where you have a government shutdown in place in an industry which is affecting people's lives, then you need to look at particular support packages. So, for example, if you're looking at the arts, or you're looking at international tourism sectors, for example, or hospitality, where there is still some form of government shutdown in place, then you would need to look at packages. I mean, that's only fair.
Right, and just finally, Concetta Fierravanti-Wells crossed the floor on this vote for an inquiry into the Australia-Chinese relationship. It's a pretty volatile one right now. It's a pretty important one. Why would an inquiry be a bad idea?
Well, that's why I love my party, Tom, because we're allowed to express a view and not be expelled. So, very much, we welcome people having different views. That is not the policy of our government. We don't conduct foreign affairs through a Senate inquiry process, but I very much, defend my colleagues' right to express a different view.
You weren't tempted to express one yourself? I mean, it seems pretty logical on one level, doesn't it, to have an inquiry into something so important and so volatile right now?
I don't think it is the role of the legislature to conduct foreign policy in that form. I think it is the role of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister to conduct our relations with that very important partner. So that is my position, and that's why I voted the way I did.